Hello and welcome back to the Jasa channel. In this lampworking project, we're going to bend a glass rod several times to form a box around a marble. This task should be some good practice for some of the basic skills, yet offer a good challenge for the beginner. Now I'm starting on this oversized rod here, which is full of explosive stress. I'm going to have to bring it up to working temperature in the kiln. But I recommend starting out on a smaller rod, 7 to 14 millimeter, especially if you're on a one-stage torch. I wanted to make a larger marble for this demonstration, and I find it's easier to start with a larger rod rather than trying to gather up a smaller one to a large size. This is a little bit too big for the torch though, so I'm going to have to separate it into two sections. You may end up pulling out very thin strings and strands during this process, which can end up being pokey, so for safety it's good to melt those back. And now we'll start with the basics of the marbling process, which is applying heat and rotation. As the glass liquefies, it wants to flow down, which gets counteracted by the rotation, and so it gets stuck in this state of flow and ends up gathering up. You can also point the marble more upward towards the ceiling or downwards towards the floor to slump it back into a disc or to pull it out more into a taper, which is why you see me holding it upward at an angle a lot of the times to help that rod slump back. I'm going to lightly attach a puntee on one end in order to remove the rod from the other and finish that side. Generally, you can form up about 70% of the marble from one side, but doing this by hand, it's difficult to get the curvature exact, and that's where the marble molds come into play. But I do recommend starting out your practice without the molds. That way you have a basic understanding of where to work from. I know I left a bit too much glass at the end here. I just hate wasting materials. And so I'm going to have to reshape the whole thing to incorporate that glass into the marble. And this can be a bit of a long and repetitive process, but I do find it a bit soothing. There's a certain tranquility about it. The marble is also reaching the max size for this torch. Lampworking is great for detailed work, but the size of your work is one of the limitations. Now that I have the marble pretty well shaped, I'm going to warm my claw grabbers in the back of the flame. Not to the point that they're glowing though, as I don't want to damage the tool. But cold tools can damage the glass. As they absorb the heat, they can create stress points. I'll melt that last punting mark out and let it cool off in the kiln, and start on my next marble, which is a cadmium red. Now, cadmium colors are a little bit more sensitive to the heat, so I'll be working it a little bit further out in the flame. Cadmium is used for yellow, orange, and reds, and tends to glow at a lower temperature than the glass. This will cause it to appear to shift in color from yellow to red before the glass is hot enough to glow orange. That makes it a great color to learn with as you can track the heat. And now I'll switch over to a cadmium chartreuse to create the square. I'll heat and rotate until the rod is liquid all the way through to the center before I bend it. And after about 5 seconds, it'll be solid again, and so you don't have a lot of time working outside of the flame. I'll make another bend below that one to create a gap small enough that the marble can't pass through. The square that forms a gap does need to be larger than the marble so that you can have 4 of them on each side. So the inspiration for this project comes from an old geometry problem called squaring the circle. That is, trying to mathematically factor the circle in the same way as a square through sides and angles. It was eventually dropped for the irrational number pi, which is a number when you multiply the circle's diameter, the distance straight through will reveal the length of the perimeter, the circumference around the circle. And when you overlap both the circle and square of the same area, you'll have the circle extending past the sides, but being contained within the corners of the square, which is what we're going for here. Now, rebending an area or fixing a problem can be difficult to do without leaving a mark. Here I'm going to reheat this corner and pull up and push in at the same time. If I just push in, it's going to create a crease. And so by pulling it, I'm going to stretch the glass out a little bit to prevent that. And at this stage in your practice, I do recommend rebending or refixing your work rather than starting off with new. It's not always possible to be fixed, but it's a good learning experience to mess around with it for a while. So in my YouTube Shorts video, I mentioned that this would be a good project for a beginner with a couple weeks under their belt to practice on. And I say that more because of the challenge of the task, not because you'll be able to complete it. I had a little bit of a challenge myself trying to complete it. My first problem was not accounting for the thickness of the rod on that last bend. And so I'll have to remove some glass from the start of the rod before the first bend. That way when I bend it over, it's nice and level. My other problem was making the gaps too wide. Only a millimeter or two smaller than the marble. And so if the bend is just a couple degrees too wide, the marble would just fall out. And too small, then the rods won't fit around the marble. So there is a sweet spot there. Now what do you do if your glass rod is too short? One solution is to attach another glass rod to it, like a 7mm clear rod here in my right hand. I'll melt them together with a very hot connection and then give it a little bit of a pull, and that can help align the axis of both rods. Another option is a tool called a rod holder, which comes in different variations, sometimes an alligator clip or a set screw. Here's another technique you can practice. Melt the rod in the center and let it slump down at an angle. Let it cool for a few seconds, then reheat the area and try to slump it back into place without any tools, just gravity. And so I'm going to start in on another cadmium marble, yellow this time. I'm going to be working further out in the flame to keep from boiling the color. This does take longer though. Once you boil out a spot, if you don't remove it, the area will become easier to boil later. And that's where the tweezers come in handy, or you can swipe it off with another glass rod. And when it comes to rotation speed for these marbles, I think consistency is really important. Sometimes I'll slow down my rotational speed just to make sure I'm spinning it more consistently to give it a more even heat. I have some transparent cobalt blue with a little sparkle. I'll bend up to make the next square. The difference between a transparent cobalt and an opaque cobalt is just the concentration of cobalt colorant they put into the mix. So that higher concentration of the opaques make it a bit stiff, almost like working with dough. Whereas the clear glass at those same temperatures will flow like water. So in an attempt to make this next one, the marble just kept falling out. It just wasn't working. And the mistake was I made the gaps too large. But the mistake isn't the problem. Not learning to correct the mistake is. For this one, I've restarted on this new one already. You might see it's a bit smaller, but our mistakes and problems can often be a free lesson in life. They're not something to be afraid of. Unlike this final square, to trap the first large marble, it's going to be so heavy, tweezers won't cut it. I'm going to have to hold it by hand once we get to that point. But now, as I'm making these bends, you'll notice I try to look at it from multiple angles. That's very important. A structure can look in line from one direction, but when viewed from different angles, you can see it may be off. And so if you've liked this video so far, hitting that like button can increase the likelihood of it getting shown to others. You can share it, which is more of a direct way to get it shown, and even subscribe. That way you don't lose the channel. You can also leave a comment if you have any questions, or if you just want to say hi. But one common question with these projects is the annealing process, or using the kiln. Heating the glass can be destructive, but cooling even more so. The glass contracts down on itself as it cools, and so it's best to do this very, very slowly. If not, then you can leave stress in the glass, which could lead to cracking. But those without a kiln, you can still practice on smaller projects like these. You can also cover your work or find different ways to slow down the cooling process to make it less destructive. As a last resort, you can try to bathe it out more above the tip of the flame where it's only a few hundred degrees. As I'm finishing the last bend here, you can see I'm holding the marble back with my little finger. If the marble did roll forward and contact the molten glass, the marble might be too cold to actually fuse to it. It would take the marble a few moments to reach a high enough temperature to start melting. It would stress it out though, at least the outside layers. It's good to remember when we're thinking about a single object like a marble or drinking glass, it's not just a single layer, but it has thickness. Layers on layers of molecules are creating this object. With less glass layers, a thinner thickness, it will cool a lot faster, heat almost instantly, also become flexible. And now with the final one done, we'll check out the blue one first. You'll see that these gaps will look a little small compared to the next one. This marble is a little smaller than the yellow one. It's about ready to pop out. This big one is quite heavy. You can see the marble does come out about a fourth of the way. And that's the end of this lesson on squaring the marble. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. My name's Jasa. Stay melty.